Breton, Gil Weinberg, and Larry Heck. So is Mason here? Yeah, come down. There you go. Congratulations.
The fact that our invited speaker is also someone called Gil Weinberg is purely a coincidence. But it is my delight to introduce our invited speaker, Gil Weinberg. Professor Weinberg is a professor in the School of Music Technology here at Georgia Tech. He's also the founding director of the Center for Music Technology. Gil is not only my Georgia Tech colleague, he's also my colleague at the Graphics Visualization and Usability Center, which is a co-sponsor for it. And we are also colleagues at a TEDx talk series about 5 years back, when Gil gave a talk and then I gave a talk. And that was a fun service.
It was.
Gil's work is at the intersection of 4 key ideas: creativity, music, competition, and robotics. And I think he's a pioneer at the intersection of these 4 areas. So please join me in welcoming Professor Gil Weinberg.
Thank you very much. So I direct the robotic musicianship group at Georgia Tech. And what we try to do is to build robot musicians as opposed to musical robots. And the distinction that I make is a robot musician is first a musician. So it has to have a brain, it has to understand music, reason about music, and then it also plays music acoustically. So it has algorithm, but it also has a body. As opposed to musical robots, the way I look at it is anything from the player piano from 100 years ago is a musical robot, get instructions and follow it. So we are focusing first on the brain, and partly that's why we use robots that use simple actuation of sound, mostly percussive. We don't go to all the more sophisticated ways to generate sound. In Japan, it's very common to have 50 or 60 degrees of freedom for a robot to try to imitate sound. We focus a little less on that and more on the brain. And our ultimate goal is that these robots will inspire us, humans, that will create an entity that you can play with, not an instrument that you play or robots that you play, but some entities that you play with, and that using algorithms and mechanical abilities, it will connect to us as humans, but also surprise us and inspire us to create music differently. In other words, we want it to be creative, which may be a reason of why I'm here today, talking a little bit about creativity. So when we try to develop artificial creativity, we first have to look at human creativity. What do we talk about when we talk about creativity? And obviously, it's about creating something new. So this is a brain as we used to think about it up until, I don't know, several dozen years ago, where you have the analytical side on one side and the creative side on the other. And obviously today we know that this is not the case. This is, of course, there are Broca areas that are only on the left side. So some things are in particular areas of the brain, but when you are involved in creative activity, your whole brain is shooting all over the place. For example, when you play music or listen to music, you have the temporal lobe, the auditory cortex shooting by just listening, and you have the frontal lobe, planning, attention, emotions around the brain, down to the amygdala. Motor cortex is shooting when you listen and play music, because music is so much connected to movement. Hippocampus memory is a big element that we are activating when we play music. Music is a lot about anticipation, trying to see what happened before and anticipate what will happen later. So it shoots all around the brain. And what we try to do in our group is to maybe take this kind of blurring of the lines one step further and say it's not analytical versus creative. We can, using analytics and maybe algorithms, generate creativity. So it's really something that is not a pie in the sky. It's not something that is different than anything that we may be able to try to model, using rule-based or using data. I'll talk about multiple approaches. So the first thing we know about creativity, as I mentioned before, is that it's about creating something new. But obviously, when we look at these people, we don't necessarily think that this is creative. Why not? There is no originality, we assume, in what they do. So it's not only new, it has to be something original, something personal, and even more important than that, it's probably about a new or original idea, not just a new and original artifact. The ideas can lead to an artifact, but you have to have something new, and these people here probably don't. And of course, there is a counter argument for that. I don't know if you see this video, it became quite viral last year. This is David Lynch talking about creativity, and he's saying there's no such thing as an original idea. And he compares actually ideas to fish and says just like you don't make fish, you don't make an idea. You catch a fish. So you catch ideas from society, from culture. You sit there with metaphorical rod, and you try to take ideas from other people and mold them and create something new. And this goes to talk about whether creativity is revolutionary or evolutionary. David Lynch probably thinks it's more evolutionary, and each one of you probably put it in a different place across the spectrum. There's also another question of new to whom? Is it only new to you? So if you're a kid that just put a stick in a rod and goes around your kindergarten and move a wheel, you just invented a wheel. I'm sure most people will say it's creative, but society will value something that will be actually creative for society, some new original ideas that no one has been creating before. Another important element is, can it only be new and original and something that the universe has never seen before for us to consider it as creative? And this is just my simulation for maybe a random number generator, which very quickly, in a few seconds, can create a list of numbers so that the universe has never seen before in this particular order. And obviously, we will not consider that as creative. So why not? It's original. The world has never seen it before, and it's new. And I think the main reason, we talked about personal before, but the main reason is that it's not meaningful to humans. And that's, again, a picture that I found to try to represent humans that are being affected by something that is meaningful for them. Some people talk about beautiful. It has to be new, personal, original, and beautiful to people. If you're talking about art, and then go ahead and define beautiful. Some people talk more about utilitarian. If you're a designer, you want it to be useful for humans. But what's important is that humans are in the center of everything that, and how humans perceive and use this new original idea is at the center of what creativity is. And of course, there's multiple ways for go about creativity. This is a more deliberate way. You go to a cabin, and 3 months, you write, you delete, you rewrite, and throw to the garbage in a very cinematic way. You come, you take it back, and after 3 months, you have a beautiful symphony, and that's a very interesting way of creating, being creative and creating something that they will appreciate. It's very different than this way, which is a more spontaneous way to create creativity, when you just go and improvise and immediately create new ideas on the fly. And there's also a version somewhere in between, or some maybe even different. Chris Csikszentmihalyi is talking about, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi is talking about flow, and that's a picture that I found for flow, which is some kind of energized, all-focused, immersed by your activity. Some of us who are lucky enough to have experienced that know how amazing that feeling is. You look at the watch, and after 3 hours, you didn't even notice that time passed and something new has happened. So very different ways to go about creativity. And we looked at all of them when we tried to develop our robotic musicians. And mainly we looked at how should we go about creating something that is meaningful for human, yet new and original. And the first approach that we looked at was, let's develop robots that are listening like humans. So they create a connection with us humans to understand music the same way we do. So if it's a chord progression, or if it's a tension release, or syncopated rhythm versus stable rhythm versus unstable rhythm, let's try to embed this understanding in these robots. That's the listen like a human part. But then when they play and when they improvise, let's use algorithms that humans will never use. Either they just don't tend to, or in most cases, they just can't, because we don't have this kind of, our brain is not built this way to run multiple generations of genetic algorithms, or to do fractals in real time and come up with ideas. And the goal was that this how we'll create entities that create music that relate to us, but also surprise us and hopefully inspire us. This is the first effort from many, many years ago, as you can see by the color of my hair. This is Scott Driscoll, and with him, a master student, we worked on the listen like machine part. This is our effort at stability and similarity, looking at multiple papers from cognitive science of how people went about understanding and modeling humans' perception of stability and similarity. I'm going to go low into the math, but you can see this is based on Tanguin paper from 1993. This is how you measure similarity and come up with a coefficient similarity between different rhythm stability. This is based on a paper from Design and Honing. You measure the distances between each one of the notes here, and then you come up with a coefficient giving preferences to multiplication of 1 and 2 and maybe less 3, and you take all of the average between all the different ratios between the different notes, and you come up with a stability coefficient for this pattern. And then we actually generated 100,000 small bits with coefficient for stability and similarity between them, just automatically. And we try to see if human perceives this similar to how we created it in an algorithm, to see that if we got it right, if we try to model it with rules right. And this is a little user study, a video from a little user study. There's subtitles explaining what we did here. This is just detecting the rhythm with a microphone inside the drum. Based on our algorithm.
Right, I'm going to play your original one just one more time.
Okay, and then we asked people, and we got a correlation of 0.8 something, which is not bad, because not every person will agree with other people about what's more or less stable. And then we used it in a little performance. This is again, Scott Driscoll is playing rhythm, and highly is generated, have a curve of should I, it asks himself, or we have some rule-based system, should I play something in the same level of stability, more similar, less similar, and we can draw a curve, and you will see how sometimes it's really capturing what Scott is doing, but sometimes it kind of goes, based on these algorithms, goes away, and Scott is building on what Hailey is doing, and vice versa, creating some kind of inspiration. Well, maybe very little, but that was the first step. That's almost a new idea, very unsimilar. Scott is building on it in a very similar way. Scott has his algorithm for similarity as well, and they go back and forth, creating something that can be compelling. And here is us in Israel actually introducing the algorithms to this darbuka player that morning, and the performance was in the evening. And if you look at his face, at the reaction, I think we achieved something that was the beginning of something that can be promising. Now you'll hear some beat detection and some morphing. I'll explain after the clip. So we detected the beat. The big hand gives the beat. The small arm is morphing between the rhythm of one drum and the rhythm and the pitch of the other drum. So we know we do pitch analysis. So if it's close to the rim, it's higher. If it's close to the center, it's lower. And we take the curve of the pitch there, and we take the the rhythm from the other one, we morph it together and create something that is a combination. And again, it might not be the most amazing rhythm you've ever heard, but it's something, humans don't do that in that particular way, which can lead to something different. Another way, things that people usually don't do is play sophisticated polyrhythms. That's another thing that we did here. Hailey, during the piece, decides what patterns to capture from us. So it can be a 7-quarter beat or a 9-quarter beat. And then later, that's another thing robots can do, memory, 10 minutes later into the piece. Drum circles can take quite a while, at least the drummers enjoy it, sometimes the audience too. It brings it back, and then it plays 7 on one arm and 9 on the other arm, and create all kind of polyrhythmic effects that humans are not likely to play, or maybe even impossible. And when I said it to Pat Metheny, who came to visit our lab because he had a big project with robots, he said, Antonio Sanchez, my drummer, can do that easily, and he can also play 4 on one leg and 11 on the other leg. So unless you're Antonio Sanchez, this is something that most people find it difficult to do, maybe impossible. And at least for us, it was inspiring. You see how we build on all of these rhythms. So I think it starts with 9 and then it goes to 7. If you're a musician, you can count the beat. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now together. Okay. Next project was Shimon, and here we actually pushed multiple directions. One of them, now Shimon can play pitch, not only rhythm. So we started only with rhythm. There's a whole world of investigation that you can do all in with beat and rhythms, but we wanted to go into melody and harmony, and Shimon was an effort to do that. And then you also see the head, and you see the camera, and I'll talk about this too. So the whole idea of gestures, interaction, and movements was very big on that. And here's maybe one of the efforts that we did pretty recently, but it shows the listening or learning like a human part. And Mason just received an award. You will see Mason's work a lot in this presentation. This is maybe the first reference to his work. So as a PhD student just starting to work with this, he looked at a bunch of music theory, jazz theory books, and try to come up with rules based on how jazz is being taught to students, what kind of notes are preferred in what kind of chord progressions, and different scales, many scales, and the preference and some kind of weights on when to use what. And then basically you give Shimon a chord progression, and Shimon generates music, listening like a human or learning like a human. And here's us playing with some of these ideas in Kennedy Center based on a chord progression that of a piece I wrote and gave to Mason. Okay. This is Guy Hoffman, who used to, he was a postdoc now he's professor for robotics in Cornell. And he actually he designed the head for Shimon. When he came, we only had the arms, but also wrote a piece of music and looked at expression and tried to have Shimon play like human and respond to humans in terms of the expression envelope. So when he played loud, Shimon responds. When he plays with the rhythm and with micro timing, he tried to have Shimon respond fast, slow, and so on. And this is a piece called Jordu. The music is pre-recorded. It's not generated like before, but how to play the music and when to play the music is based on listening in real time. So we will play it faster and slower. You see Shimon responds at the right time. Another effort to actually play like a machine and use some of these connections that we just showed, but to try to create something new using algorithms human would never use was genetic algorithm. I mentioned it before. What's interesting here is that connection to humans is the function, the fitness function, where the robot is listening to input and try to make it as similar to other pre-recorded piece of music, or maybe in real time to a saxophone player. We did a short TED Ed video about it. I will let TED Ed show you with some visual examples exactly how it works.
Evolutionary algorithms, or genetic algorithms that mimic biological evolution, are one promising approach to making machines generate original and valuable artistic outcomes. So how can evolution make a machine musically creative? Well, instead of organisms, we can start with an initial population of musical phrases. And a basic algorithm that mimics reproduction and random mutations by switching some parts, combining others, and replacing random notes. Now that we have a new generation of phrases, we can apply selection using an operation called a fitness function. Just as biological fitness is determined by external environmental pressures, our fitness function can be determined by an external melody chosen by human musicians or music fans to represent the ultimate beautiful melody. The algorithm can then compare between our musical phrases and that beautiful melody, and select only the phrases that are most similar to it. Once the least similar sequences are weeded out, the algorithm can reapply mutation and recombination to what's left, select the most similar or fitted ones again from the new generation, and repeat for many generations. Thanks to the presence of human...
Okay, so because we have this fitness function, we hope that there will be some connection, but also something that is based on random mutations that will create something interesting and new. And in real time, we did it with listening to MIDI piano and a saxophone player and have the fitness function looking for similarity using dynamic thumb warping in real time and do the maybe 50 generations or so. Of course, if we continued with multiple generations, at some point we will just play exactly what was heard. So we just stopped in the middle, so we have enough of the genes of the original populations, but we also have something new. You may know these people. This is called Train and Monk, some of my favorite musicians. Here we try to use Markov chains to imitate their style. And again, there's an element of listening like human. We try to capture the best and the greatest. And we saw in this conference multiple efforts at Markov chains and hidden Markov models. This is an effort to not only try to do the note-to-note. We did a first order. Sometimes we tried second order, but we didn't have enough data for that. But also to create something new, and again, morphing, similar to what we talked about before, morphing between the styles of different musicians was something that we hope will create something new, because humans would not have 30% of Monk, 30% of Coltrane, and 40% of your own rhythm, or of your own style being captured and played back to you, and Shimon could. So this is how it works. First, you have to play some kind of an input. You can do it with the piano. Here we had an app that you just play a melody, you send it to Shimon, and now subtitles explain what happens. This is the work of Ryan Nicolaides, who also was a master student. And as you have seen a couple of days ago, today we are doing it in a much more sophisticated way, and we try through unit selection and deep learning, this is from Mason's thesis, to capture something more inherent and not just node-to-node transitions. And I think Mason played this piece, but I'll play it one more just for you to hear the quality of the music. Well, you may have heard, the clusters and the syncopated rhythm of Monk and morphed into the crazy licks by Coltrane. Here, I think we can hear something that is better structured and more musical in a sense.
Version.
We have motif and developments. We have something that we can follow. So I can see a scenario how someone may want to buy a record like this. We are getting, and Mason played this, and also he played it later with another CD. You can find this probably online. You can create multiple different kind of music that maybe people would like to listen to. And the question is, so why do we need even robots? Well, why not just have beautiful pre-recorded music? And my main reason originally was acoustic sound. There's nothing that can replace the richness of acoustic sound, and robots can have the digital brain and also the physical body to create acoustic sound. But there are many more reasons not to just listen to music that is generated with algorithms with speakers. And one of these reasons is maybe can be demonstrated in this clip. And if you look at this band, it's not a mistake that there's no music. I want you just to look at them. You will see the synchronization, the cues, the visual interaction, the anticipation. You see the reasons why we go to listen to jazz. Sorry, jazz. That's the next one. Why we're going to a live show in general. We want to see the interaction. We want to see the gestural and the social interaction between the musicians. Even here, and of course, only one person in the world can move like Jagger, and so we put the line in the sand in a reasonable place. But even here, someone who can definitely not move like Jagger. I play piano here with a trumpet player. See how we look at each other, even though it's jazz and supposedly you can just be, listen to the music. How we look at each other when we both play, which somehow I think reinforce what we're going to respond to. Now he looks at me when I play. Now. So there's something about the visual cues that is in many genres, and even if you cannot move. And this is our first effort to actually not only listen, but also look. We had an application actually for the smaller robot called capture by nodding. We call it by dancing, but it's basically by nodding, trying to capture the beat. And here's an example of how Street Lotto, local musicians, and Shimon interact with visual cues, and how Shimon also represents what he feels with visual cues, which I think makes Lotto much more engaged. So there's a camera and beat detection. And I think as audience, you enjoy that as well, right? If you just play the music, you probably would not enjoy it as much. This is also work by Ryan Nicolaides with Tom Sherwood from the Atlanta Orchestra, Symphonic Orchestra. And here you'll see Tom moving all kind of Tai Chi-like gestures, and Shimon try to respond to the gestures, not only to the music. Control the expression of these particular melodies by how close. We're using a Kinect here because the camera in Shimon's eye didn't work, and it wasn't a depth camera anyhow. So we just put the Kinect below. This is Andrea Brown with Jonathan Sasson's work, also a master student. You see the green little marker, and Shimon is looking at the marker and responds to how Andrea conducts him. Also listening to the orchestra. That's with the Georgia Tech Orchestra. student orchestra. And of course, we did some studies to show that this is helpful. This is a work from Guy Hoffman. If you remember the beginning, the Jodo, ta 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 ta. So we measured how well the synchronization between the chords. This is the first and middle and center chord, and we measured in multiple conditions, and precise and imprecise when you have some kind of random. And you can see that when you look and listen to the robot, the music is much more synchronized, if for nothing else. It may be more engaging and so on, but you can see that it's the better synchronization, and the synchronization is even better if you're in lower than 100 BPM. So in slow rhythms, it's even more important to be able to look and synchronize. All right, so we had acoustic sound, visual cues, social cues. What are the reasons for building robots, not just focusing on symbolic music? And the reason, one of the reasons that led to this was the whole idea of embodied cognitions, which has been talked about a lot recently. Different people define it in a different way. The way I look at it is the notion that our cognition is shaped by our body. That we cannot perceive the world, interact with the world without thinking about and knowing about, and our understanding of our body is ingrained in how we perceive the world. And one simple example I give: when I play, when I improvise, I will never be able to come up with an improvisation that requires 11 fingers. Just knowing that I have 10 fingers shapes the way I play piano. And again, this is work by Mason. Creating high-level contours of music. You just give the robot the pitch contour, the tonal tension, and the note density, some other parameters. And then he's using Viterbi algorithm to do the path planning, which is a big part of his thesis. There are multiple positions for the different arms, and you have to look first at the curves, but then what's possible, so you don't collide, and this can take hours and hours to calculate. And then it comes up with a melody. And here's something very nice, a video that he prepared that really shows how different kind of body perceptions can lead to completely different kind of music. So you get these contours, and then you play with a different constraint and different positions of what the robot can play. So while it's the same melody, you hear how different it is, how different styles can emerge. And here you can see how using this Viterbi algorithm, we can get a much better results in terms of playing the music. Our base model, developed by Rob Imey, who actually was the engineer that developed the arms, was just play a note. If you get a MIDI note, and if you cannot play this note because you don't have an arm next to it, play the same pitch class in a different location. And if you cannot even reach to, if you need to play C, you cannot reach any C, just don't play the notes. And that can lead to something, but if you look at the Viterbi algorithm that Mason has developed, you see how much better production of music and virtuosity, if you will, we can get. And this is the melody he composed, and then tried it with a base model and with a Viterbi algorithm. Not so great. Much better, maybe not perfect, but better. And here it is again in concert, the kind of rhythms that were created and then played in a sequence, but you can see that Shimon has a level of virtuosity that he didn't have before. Okay. One last thing that I will say in the benefit of why robots is the whole idea of ancillary gestures. A lot of the gestures that we looked at is the gestures that actually produce music, but there's a lot of importance in music for the gestures that don't create music, the expression around it, development of personality. And I put Ozzy Osbourne talking about why you go to a show to not necessarily listen to the music. Excuse me, you know, they have some good stuff too, but you want to see a lot of the personality. And here's our effort to embed some personality in Shimon. So it didn't eat a bird and spit it, but there's some kind of other interaction, some kind of a duel between the musician and Shimon. This is Shimmy, an effort to focus mostly on gestures, ancillary in this case, or dancing gestures, because Shimmy doesn't generate music at all, it just listens. And let me show you a process of how it came to be and explain a little bit more about what we did there.
In a way, Shimmy started out as an animated character on the screen, where we worked to try to nail down his personality, and then we took that and transferred that into the real world.
It was important to us that Shimmy be able to work as a great loudspeaker. So we worked to combine high-quality drivers and amplifiers, the smoothest, most quiet motors available. Inside the robot, we're taking care of all the low-level control of the motion, but all of the personality and intelligence, really the heavy lifting, is being done on the smartphone app.
Shimmy, look at me.
Okay, and if it looks like a Kickstarter video, that's because it was a failed Kickstarter. But the goal was to have a robot that digs music, or a speaker that digs music as much as you do, that understands music, that listens to any songs that you have, or maybe even some input from the outside, and understand it and show it with gestures that he's with you. We have clapping, a little app that try to detect different songs from the library by clapping. You give it a beat. We didn't use hundreds of songs, we used just a few, but you give it a beat and it looks at its library and try to come up with the most similar song that it has and dance with it. And of course, we're using the camera on the phone, and we're using the audio from the phone. This is the work by Annie Zan, also master student who graduated, now works at Pandora. And she actually didn't look at input from musicians or from users, but actually analysis of songs, doing a lot of MIR, music information retrieval, on the songs. I will go maybe quickly at some of the low-level versus the high-level aspect ratio to try to detect the beats, the tempo, similar energies, vocalness, if there's voice or not, a lot of music information retrieval processing, and then come up with a whole system, which is a master thesis of mapping music to gestures, coming with different approaches and testing them. Not only that, creating group collaboration and different ways that the robots interact with each other based on what they listen to. For example, it can understand when the music changes from a chorus to a verse, and it will change the movements automatically. And every time it will be a little different, even for the same song, because there's a huge library of gestures that are chosen based on deterministic rules. And this works also in a very noisy environment, such as in here. A GPU Okay. we talked here, there was a session about co-creativity, and this may relate to that because the kind of robotic algorithm that we can create and the kind of artificial creativity efforts can make humans much more creative. And this is maybe a great example. This is Jason Barnes. He lost his arm maybe 5 years ago, I believe. Devastated, music was his life. Tried to make a makeshift kind of prosthesis that he can continue to play after he lost his arm. And then through someone else seeing some of our videos online and contacting me to maybe use some of our robotic and interest and music interest to develop a prosthetic arm for him. And it sounded like a great project. So we actually contracted with Mecca, which later was acquired by Google, to develop the hardware for the prosthetic arm. And what I told Jason, who wanted mainly to be able to retrieve the wrist motions, because he could still play, he has below the elbow, but he couldn't control the subtlety. If you're a drummer, you know that you really want to control the grip, how tight and how loose. And so I told him, yeah, sure, let's do that, but let's do much more than that. Let's try to have a prosthetic arm that is creative, that will inspire you, that will play not only what you plan to play and create all kinds of new experiences that are based on creativity. And he was a good sport about it. Let me show you, and that's why the second arm. In a second, I'll show how the second stick works. We have 2 sticks. This is the first time we tried the prosthetic arm on him. And again, looking at faces of people when they respond to technologies that inspire them is an interesting. So look at how he responds to this.
Flex.
Using EMG, by the way.
Flex.
I didn't mention that it sends EMG.
Flex.
So I think he's smiling this way because he was never able to play this kind of rhythms. This is again polyrhythm. I like to return to things that work. But not only that, each stick can play 20 hertz, much faster than any human. Like the competitions for fast drummings, 12 hertz or maybe 13 is the top that humans. Here you can play so fast that it almost sounds like a timbre. And of course, if you can one of them play 20 and one of them play 19, you can create crazy polyrhythms. Let me show you how it works in behind under the hood. And Jason is talking over.
In this video, I demonstrate how I control the robotic drumming prosthesis using my forearm muscle. The EMG electrodes attached to my arm send very low latency signals to trigger the robotic stick when I contract my muscle. This allows me to operate the arm in different ways. For example, I can trigger a hit with every contraction, or toggle between different automatic drumming states. This allows me to create cool interactions between my biological arm and my robotic one.
So that's for the sticky controls, and this is the work of Roosbeck and Dambashi, who helped minimize the latency to a way that they can actually play it one-to-one. Here's some examples of how it works in a concert, and first we'll show the difference between what he wanted, between the 2 states that he wanted to explore, one with tight grip and the other with loose grip. You just change the way the muscles work, or with a button, or however you want, and you can control and create much more expression for an amputee. Tight. This, and now with loose. You can hear the bounce. And now we can do that. It can bring it back, and if you're a drummer, you know how important that is. But of course, we can do other things. So let's start to explore those. For example, the playing and toggling between very fast. So there's some shared control. He decides where to play, how to play, but the robot itself generates very, very fast notes that create new timbres. Polyrhythm again. And this is one of the clips that a lot of heavy metal drummers would, I would say, give their arm to be able to play this. I'm not sure if they would, but see how he used the speed to control and create different timbres. And here's an example of an arm with a mind of its own. And the idea was that one arm will respond directly to what he does with the EMG, and the other stick will improvise, maybe a pre-recorded pattern or maybe some algorithmic patterns, and he will have to somehow respond to it and play with this shared control. So here's an example of one arm controlled and one arm stick generated pre-recorded rhythm that Jason has to respond to and play with different drums and create something that would make sense. See different arms doing different things. Different sticks can do different things. One of the sticks can respond to his arm, to the master. So he can hover around one drum, but he can also explore the drum space around him. So in this case, it was a pre-recorded beat, but so the first time he played with it, it was kind of exciting. But you can also think about generated beat in real time. I think one of the most exciting things is when we let Andrew, the guitar player from Kennesaw State, play with Jason. And not only that the arm comes up with its own ideas, now Andrew controls one of the sticks. And Jason, in a very strange way, very strangely intimate way, have to play with someone who actually controls his own body in a way and respond to that. First, I'll show how different chords generates different rhythms by Jason. So with every chord, you'll see how the speed changes. And of course, you'll see Mason there too in the background. And here it is in actually in a performance, and I think this is much better than Jason played before with his new abilities. It took some time to learn, and if you ask him, he will tell you that in the beginning it was not so intuitive, but look what he's doing here while playing some kind of a break, while being controlled by Andrew, different chords from Andrew. Okay, quickly I go through this latest project that we have. I don't have too much time, but it was pretty successful with Jason. We've been traveling with him and Mason and some local musicians performing around the world. We said, why not everyone? Why wouldn't we develop a third arm that everyone can use and have these abilities? And this is Tyler White, and who worked mostly on the engineering. He's the electrical engineer of this arm. And let me show how it works. We're using Kinect to know where the arms are, human arms, and move the robotic arm accordingly to complement the right drums. We do some music listening. And you'll see this EEG cap. We just started. We don't have great results yet, but here the EEG actually is used as a gyrometer just to look at Chris Moore, the percussion professor at Georgia Tech, to sense where the head is. It's a different kind of shared control. And based on where the head is looking, that's what changes where the arm is. So we try different approaches, and we're about to do some studies to see what works best. Another approach is to look at brain signals, because you have so much going on when you play. Maybe we can directly plug it to your brain. This is the work from Mike Winters, a PhD student in my group. We were not able to get anything meaningful from EEG from a drummer that moves around. There's too much artifacts. But we were able, in one case, to get someone else using SSVP, if you're familiar with this, visual evoked potential, solid state visual evoked potential. You concentrate on a screen and you can control between two states. And here someone else is controlling them. All right, pattern. So the pattern changed. And now we'll try to think about something else that will move, concentrate on a particular flickering that will move the arm to a different, which is not great. This is not what we want. We want the real musician to do it, but it's a first step. This is Deepak Gopinath, who his master project was trying to improve expression. Again, if you're a drummer, you appreciate it. This is how different drummers can control, how drummers can control the expression with multiple ways of holding the stick. And now we just have tight or loose, but we wanted to model, and Deepak is an engineering student, model how these different hits can be done. And here's some of the results that were not implemented yet in the arm, but can be promising. Okay. Latest project, this is not ours. You may be familiar with this, but we call it the Skywalker project. We try to actually sense more in using learning, deep learning, to analyze data, electric and other, from the muscle to be able to have much more sophisticated control. So you can see here that we can look at the muscle and be able to actually move finger by finger. And this is JSON using EMG sensors, multiple myoelectric, as you may be familiar with. In the left hand, in his left hand, he's trying to show what he thinks to do, the phantom action from his amputee. So ignore this. This is just simulating what he tries to do to show that we have some kind of control, and we try to get it much more accurate in a way that hopefully will allow him to play piano. All right, I have maybe 3 more minutes, so I will try to go quickly over some of the criticism that you may think, maybe save you some of the questions later. So I often get questions such as the following ones. One of the questions, I think one reported almost phrases as, "Are you evil?" She was a little more polite, but in other words, how dare you take music from us and give it to the robots? We're okay with robots building cars. We're okay with robots even being smart enough to clean floors. But music is the most human things. How dare you? And of course, this is not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to inspire humans. It's all about, if you see in all the interaction, humans play with a robot. It will enhance our creativity. It will inspire us, hopefully lead to the kind of experiences that we love about music, you know, shivers down the spine and blowing your mind or make you cry or whatever gets you when you play music. So it's about humans, not robots, and this is one more tool. A version of this question is, will they take our jobs? And I think not. And I think if anything else, it's actually created new jobs, partly for my students, but also for people like Jason, who couldn't play and now he can play. If you look at fire, phones, or cameras, or vinyls, and this is Emil Berliner who invented vinyl, that's a picture. They all were criticized as something that will kill jobs, or will kill people in the case of fire. But it also, obviously there are risks, but also without fire, we wouldn't be able to cook today, and we would probably live until the age of 30 or so. And the Luddites that in the Industrial Revolution found other jobs, maybe better jobs, when the looms became automated. Camera actually created a whole new art form, photography. It wasn't there before. They thought, hey, there will be no more painting. Painting was very realistic there, but now we have a camera. We have more jobs and more interest and more arts. Vinyl's the same. Without vinyl, we wouldn't have scratching. We wouldn't have maybe hip hop the way we know it today. Anything else, you know, samplers, the same. Even Spotify, people criticized that it will kill, but now we start to see that. Autotune, okay, maybe not autotune. Autotune is evil. But in general, I think this will help create more jobs. Another question that I get is, but will it ever have soul? You know, music is about soul. If I get musicians, I hear some skepticism about this not being expressive and soulfulness. I have two kind of answers for it. First, right, in the foreseeable future, I don't think that we can encode soul into robots. But what can happen is that humans bring their souls and emotions and consciousness and all of the great thing about humans. Robot brings their mechanical abilities, which can be crazy, and the algorithms that are different than humans, and together there will be a spark that would lead to new music. But actually, there is another possible answer for that. And some people have been trying to explore this, and the answer may say there will be ability, and there's nothing sacred about soul. There's no such, we can algorithmize soul, talking about the left and right. You know, if a 3-pound lump of gray matter obeying nothing but the law of physics can lead to a sense of self, you know, first-person experience, why couldn't a larger lump of, I don't know, electronic or quantum computing be able to do that? And indeed, Donald Hoffman, this is taken from his efforts to try to model consciousness, how you work between the world and action and so on. I will not get into that. There's also Marvin Minsky that talk about society of minds. We don't have one consciousness or one soul. It's a big society that competes for the foreground. And indeed, in split brain experiments, when the corpus callosum has been severed, we see that people can at the same time try to put their clothes on and take them off because we have multiple consciousnesses, not one thing that is sacred and soul. Even free will, we have evidence that it doesn't necessarily something that we have, you know, from Libet's experiments showing a buildup of electric activity in the brain before you're even aware, in the motor cortex, before you're even aware that you want to do something. To interviews of musicians playing piano, the muscle memory, you don't even know what, you're not aware of what your body is aware of. So maybe the whole idea of free will is just a post hoc reconstruction of the events. And why would we need all of this concept? You see, I modified a little bit the evolutionary picture here. And that's obviously because of evolution. We need them to survive. It's not about how the world is outside, it's about what works for us. And if we're talking about evolution, we may be in the midst of punctured the punctured equilibrium. We may be in a speciation movement where we actually, with all of this augmentation, can lead to a new species to evolve, and maybe, you know, if evolution will call for it, robots that will need soul will develop soul and will lead us to this kind of shivers, crying, ecstatic, blow our mind kind of experiences. And of course, there's the dystopian vision that talks about conscious and free will lead to the uprising. I think a bigger problem is that all of this development may lead to inequality. You know, if people can augment themselves this way, and also memory chips and so on, that's a much bigger problem than the uprising. But just to end my talks, I will show you a silver lining of, even if the uprising happens, there may be something that that can help us with that, and I will let someone who tells a better jokes than I do talk about that.
Jazz robots, which combines two of the biggest threats to our nation, jazz and robots. He's been programmed to dig it too, bobbing his head to the beat and checking in with his fellow players, meaning that long after the robot uprising kills all humans on Earth, there will still be someone on the planet pretending to enjoy jazz.
Thank you. Questions, comments?
Well, thank you for a really entertaining and interesting talk. It's been terrific. And it's great to see this stuff being used to make individuals' lives better as well, you know, in that really concrete way. It's fantastic. One thing that struck me in all of these very impressive demonstrations is that you don't seem generally to be interested in copying human physiology in your robots. So you've tended to bring existing robotic techniques to music rather than using music to develop techniques, and particularly thinking in terms of drumming, where, you know, I mean, the human drummer is a really floppy thing, right? And your robots are not floppy, for one thing. So I wonder if you have any interest in that kind of work, of kind of using the music to drive the robotics.
So the reason we didn't go there, maybe a couple of reasons. One of them, it's much simpler to just have one solenoid, rotational solenoid, and immediately explore some of the more interesting aspects that I'm interested in. The other reason is, and it might sound as an excuse in this case because it is about being easy as well, is that I want to try different anatomies. I want to see the playing like a machine aspect is more interesting for me than imitating in this sense. So while we didn't really put a lot of effort in making all kind of sophisticated gesture to generate sound, it does have 8 sticks. People don't have, marimba players don't have 8 sticks. It does have 4 arms. People don't have 4 arms. So that's why we explore different aspects. If you are interested in robots that actually imitate human anatomy, there are amazing efforts. In Japan, Waseda University have a flutist, I don't know if you've seen this, with pumps, pushing airs with 6 degrees of freedom in the lips, with a bunch of degrees of freedom in the fingers. It still doesn't sound like humans. It's much more difficult to generate a convincing flute sound. But you can learn about the human anatomy and you can maybe create interesting sounds this way. It's just not what we've been focusing on.
So that's a perfectly reasonable answer. I agree. So one thing that is particularly interesting about the floppy drummer is the need for anticipation. And you have that very controlled here. So what it strikes me that is a really interesting problem in music, is this ability to anticipate the beat so that your drum hits, so your stick hits the drum at the time of the beat and not sometime after it, right? And that is a relatively easy problem for you. And I like to try to solve hard problems. I'm just wondering if you have any interest in that because of your interest in the cognition.
We do. Guy Hoffman did work on anticipation, but the other way. So it looked at the robot and it anticipated what's going to happen based on the physicality of the robot and showed that by looking at the robot, it's better. Doing it the other way, it's also interesting. I have a new student, Zach Conduct, who is now trying to look at the ancillary gestures and learn how humans prepare for gestures and embed it in the robot. And this can lead to these kind of studies that you mentioned.
Thank you. I guess it's somewhat related, but one of the experiences I've had trying to teach beginners how to play jazz is teaching them how to swing, particularly people from other cultures. And I noticed that Shimon tends not to swing. I was wondering what your experience of teaching robots to swing has been.
I'm still trying to learn how to swing myself. So I think swing, if you look at my slide, I said, will robot ever have soul? And in parentheses, I wrote swing. I think it's equivalent of swing. It's this je ne sais quoi about music that you can try to teach, but either you have it or don't. It's an amazing challenge. I would be happy to talk to you about how to try to make it swing. I would love to hear how you teach your students to swing and how you're successful. Or obviously, there's some innate elements here. I'm a big believer in education, but some people just can't swing. And I think once we figure out what is about swings that we can maybe model, or maybe deep learn again, just throw a bunch of swings into the machine and hopefully a swing will be captured.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. I particularly liked when you were talking about how jazz musicians are communicating visually when they play, because that gets missed out so much, that kind of non-verbal communication. But I have a question, which is possibly for Mason instead of you. When you reported about the work that Mason has done in going through lots of jazz books to get rules for jazz theory, how to play, is this data available? Because I would love it for a new project. If you've got that data available in any kind of form, I'd love to talk to you about that.
Yeah, we have to talk to you. Essentially, I mean, the data is the jazz books for stuff like that, and then I just go through what are the most important things I need to capture to make this sound reasonable. So I have like a list of things that the features that I got in the books, but yeah, you have to do that.
Other questions or comments? But I have one. I'll use my time to like. Oh, okay. So, about 30, 40 years back, David Marr did some work on computer vision. And then he came up with this theory of how images get into a primal sketch and 2D image and 2.5D image before object recognition occurs.
Say again?
So he had a theory of how there are different stages of vision, so a raw image gets interpreted. So I wonder whether, based on your work or other work going on listening to music and understanding music, there is the beginning of a similar theory of music understanding, where I play any music and it first gets, there are levels of abstraction, and those abstractions are well defined so that we know what those levels are so that music could be understood.
So there are two approaches for that. One is rule-based, and you talk to jazz educators, and they will tell you, and then you try to embed it or implement it. And then there is the data-based, the deep learning. And again, Mason has worked a lot of auto-encodings that would try to get some features. And of course, in the low level and the deep level of the deep network, we don't have access. But then when we listen to what comes, we can say, yeah, here I can hear how we captured tension and release, which is an important element of music. And here I can see how there was a rhythm that was not stable and now becomes stable. So I don't know if 40 years ago they worked with deep learning for vision, probably not, but I think this is a promising direction.
Two more.
I'm very interested in your gestural work because of the different morphology you have in your robots. So do you think there's any scope for imitation learning where you can take the kind of movements that people do and translate them to these really interesting non-human morphologies in your work?
Interesting. Baxter, teaching by example with gestures. There's a lot of work here. Obviously here, Andrea Thomas' work on this and some others. I think it can be implemented in music, and if you're interested to talk about it, I'll be happy to talk.
So much. This was a great talk. My question is super short. Why straight ahead jazz? I mean, we have new tools here that you could create a new musical style that didn't exist before. So why straight ahead jazz?
So actually, I'm working on a new show that will not be about jazz. So good question, and definitely doesn't have to be only jazz. As to why so far we've been focusing on jazz, I play jazz, I like jazz. We looked at genres where improvisation is at the core, because it was a lot about listening and improvising. So you saw a drum circle, which is not really jazz, which is another genre where there's a lot of improvisation and try to capture and build. You even saw the marimba. Maybe you didn't see the marimba band. You chose us two marimba, but this was inspired by African marimba band, street marimba band, where there's a lot of interlocking rhythms, which I wouldn't necessarily call jazz the marimba piece. But jazz obviously is one of the main genres in which we improvise. I didn't show a clip, but we just worked with a rock band, also like a jam band. I can show you what they did, improvisation. Anywhere where in real time you have to come up with new ideas and hopefully inspire other humans we're interested in. And now I'm looking more into electronica and real electronics. And of course, yes, it can lead to new genres, and that's part of the goals. That's what we are trying to do. We avoided the experimental NIME kind of music, because there's a lot of new things here, and we just want to introduce things one step at a time. You still can connect to jazz. I was big into the NIME community, but stayed away. I'm not sure that a new genre actually will be created from that. But maybe when we combine with deep learning things from multiple genres, in the latest efforts that Mason showed a clip from, there's Lady Gaga and Mozart and Beatles in the data set. Maybe new genres will evolve this way.
Just a follow-up question. I mean, quickly thinking, you could put, for example, 12 arms, but not 4. But 4 is very, anthrophonic, because that's what the vibraphone players use, right?
Right, but it does have 8 sticks, which is double than what vibraphone playing. Yes, and you can do, and you saw some of the experiments with different arms that will sound differently. There's also the whole complication of mechanical ability and building stuff and making it fit with my NSF budget. We could hardly build the one with the 8 sticks.
I mean, I would be interested to hear a vibraphone with like 12 mullets. And then
well, you can hear a vibraphone playing with 80 solenoids.
Yeah.
Pat Metheny is working with multiple of those. You just put a solenoid under each one of the sticks, and you can play crazy rhythm. You can play chords of 18 notes. You can go. For me, it's less interesting. For me, it's more interesting to have an embodied agent with visual cues, with embodied cognition, with something you can look at, with something that is compelling at a show. If you saw Orchestrion by Metheny, you'll see a wall of solenoid, pretty much, mostly solenoids. I don't, and you don't see the small gestures of solenoid hitting. I don't think it is as engaging as playing with a robot with hopefully a saw, but at least a body.
Any other questions?
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for a wonderful talk. I enjoyed it greatly. I actually tried to make a point a couple of days ago that how we understand creative music is the most difficult because it's so extremely planning. You know, it requires sort of movements. And so, I have great experience. You've probably heard of Professor Charles Smith, who's mapping use the fMRI. What is the difference between improvisation and
right.
When I talked to him and I was like, what was the biggest challenge you had? And he said, because when people improvise, they move. They
right.
have the right reading. So he was tying the hands of improvisers, trying to stabilize them because when you put them in a fMRI machine, they just have involuntary movement of their bodies, which is so extremely important
right.
to the expression of them. Thank you so much for your topic.
Thank you.
Okay, then let's thank our speaker once more.
Thanks.
And now we have coffee break, so you can talk more together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Linkola, who was the winner of the best student paper. So looking forward to your talk. Okay, over to you.
Thanks. Hello everyone. Nice to be here in ICCC. I'm Simo Linkola from University of Helsinki. And this paper wouldn't exist without my co-authors Anna Kantosalo, Tomi Männistö, and Hannu Toivonen. And the paper's title is Aspects of Self-Awareness, an Anatomy of Metacreative Systems. First of all, I want to say that I think I'm in the wrong session, in the sense that what I think this paper is more about is about software architectures. And we borrow some psychological terms, but we are not so much interested in a psychological point of view, in the sense that it's more about software architectures and self-adaptive systems than psychology. And here in the title, there is metacreative systems. So in this work, the metacreativity means the system's ability to be aware of its own creative act, and by being aware, change its creative behavior. And by creative systems, we mean simply systems that produce some kind of creative artifacts. So let's first look this one definition from 2012 from Colton and Wiggins. I guess this was a working definition of computational creativity, which says that the computational creativity is the philosophy, science, and engineering of computational systems which, by taking on particular responsibilities, exhibited behaviors that unbiased observers would deem to be creative. So I have highlighted here that it's important that the computationally creative systems take these responsibilities of some parts of the creative act. So our model, or the point of our work, is to construct a model of metacreative systems, which is kind of componential and can be also used as a software architecture, at least to some point. And the idea for the model is to use it for analyzing existing metacreative systems, to design new metacreative systems, and of course, to introduce metacreative capabilities to existing systems. And why did I actually here emphasize this by taking on particular responsibilities is that because we think that this model actually suggests different areas where the creative systems can take these responsibilities. So the model revolves around this concept of self-awareness, which means the ability to be the subject of one's own attention. And the term is, of course, borrowed from the psychology, but here we use it more in the context of self-adaptive systems. And in our model, or in our paper, we think that this self-awareness consists of two parts: self-reflection and self-control. Even though in living beings, typically you would think that there is only self-reflection, and then the self-reflection then implicitly gives the need to make some kind of self-control depending what is reflected. But here we make it explicit that we also want the control to be there. By reflection, we simply mean that the ability to monitor an aspect of a system, to gain information from it, and for possibly to generalize it, or some other ways to process that information. And by control, we mean that the system can adjust or modify that aspect of itself. And it's, at least I think it's important to notice that actually one cannot be without the other if we are talking about metacreative systems, because if we don't reflect, then the control is meaningless. We are doing something that we don't know why we are doing it. And if we only reflect, then we don't have control, so we are actually not changing anything in the system. And that leads us to the kind of definition of the metacreative systems in the paper, which says that the metacreative system is a system that uses reflection and control over some aspects of itself to change its own creative behavior. So it is aware of these aspects of itself, and it has meaningful connections from what is reflected to how this reflection is affected in control. What kind of comes from this is that actually this model works well in the systems where the creative capabilities are clearly infused some of its components, and not so well in these kind of systems where creativity comes, for example, from complex interaction between different components or agents. And from software architectural point of view, you can then think this as that we need a target that is actually reflected and controlled on, and then we can have this manager component that is in charge of the reflection and control. We could, of course, have here also this manager could be separated to several managers, but we will see later why it's actually kind of reasonable to try to keep it actually in one component. So to the meat of the actual model, the different aspects of self-awareness. We propose these 6 different aspects of self-awareness, and here you can see kind of a conceptual drawing of their different relationships. So the aspects are artifact awareness, generator awareness, goal awareness, interaction awareness, time awareness, and meta-self-awareness. And if we look at the 4 first, we can actually see that these are pretty obvious for us as computational creativity researchers. We are interested in artifacts we create. We are interested in what kind of generators generate these artifacts. We are interested in our system's goals. And of course, we are interested in interaction, for example, in co-creativity. But the latter 2 might not be so obvious to all of you. I will try to cover why we think that they are important in this talk. So let's now go briefly over these different aspects of our awareness. Starting with artifact awareness, it's kind of the most basic thing for computational creative systems. If your system is not able to see how well it does its artifacts, and by that reflection control what it creates, we can hardly say that it's creative. At least I don't think that it's creative. Over that artifact awareness is then in a hierarchical structure, the generator awareness. So we are aware of the generator that generates the artifact. So we can reflect on our generating process and then control it, change the generator, and maybe by changing the generator, we then give the system the transformational capabilities, dubbed as Holy Grail by somebody in this conference for the system, so that actually the system changes the subspace in the creative subspace where its artifact can go and what it can produce. I think very important. Then we of course have goal awareness, and in creative systems, depending on the design, we can have various different goals. For example, here we can see that system can have goal on its artifacts, what it wants to generate. It can have goal on the generator, what kind of generators it's wants, and it can have goal on the interaction. And these goals can of course be conflicting. It's very typical that on the other hand, you might, in the co-creative system, the system wants to satisfy its own internal evaluation, and also it wants to satisfy the user's needs. So the goal-aware system can, for example, reflect on these different goals and strike a useful balance between these different goals. So in a sense, the system can change its own evaluation of how well it is doing. The next aspect of awareness is interaction awareness, that is directed to the environment and the other agents in the environment. So it allows the system to gain information from the environment and by gaining information to control how it interacts with the environment. And it may induce, for example, the system have some kind of theory of mind, for which we had quite nice discussion, I think, in co-creative workshop on Monday. Then next, time awareness. And it's not highlighted because we think that time awareness cannot exist on its own. You cannot reflect on time on its own, or you cannot control time. You always have this time awareness in conjunction to some other aspect. So, for example, if you have time awareness in artifact awareness, then you can reflect on the artifacts, and by that you can have a notion of time with what happens, and kind of it allows the system to understand its own creation history or own history, and also anticipate the future development. And I like to try to put it bluntly, what we mean by this, that it's not simply enough for a system to somehow see that there's some change, but it has to have explicit notion of the time and take it into consideration when it's making the changes and reflection. So it kind of, for example, it can see that how it allocates its resources in time and change those resource allocations to come up with certain plans and certain anticipations and whatnot. And lastly, we have meta self-awareness, which is awareness of one's own awareness. So the awareness of these other aspects of awareness. And it's really powerful term, or meaning the kind of covering the executive processes, all the executive processes of the system, which kind of work on the higher level of the other aspects of awareness. And potentially it merges information from these other aspects of awareness into one unified view of the system state. So now, once we have these different aspects of awareness, reflection and control, what we actually need for a meaningful or informed meta-creativity is to have something that connects the reflection to the control. And in the paper, we didn't have too much time to go through this. In the future work, I would really much like to work more on this, but we separate two different kinds of connections. Exogenous, which are given, originate from outside of the system, and endogenous that are originate from inside the system, for example, learned by machine learning models or such. What is problematic in exogenous systems is that the system's designer has to have quite a lot of knowledge of the creative application space and the application is actually going to be in to make these connections. And that is something that is typically not, it might not be possible or not even desirable. And for endogenous systems, they are problematic. On the other hand, that many creative applications have chaotic or very complex application areas. So it can be very, very hard to actually see what this reflection should be affected in this kind of control. And learning this can be, is not obvious in many cases. But anyway, both of these are valid and may well coexist in the same system. So part of the system can be built with exogenous connections and part with the endogenous. And also important is to notice that these aspects are not kind of divided in the sense that you can, from reflecting on interaction, this can be affected in actually controlling the artifacts. So this can span to other aspects also. So why this model we propose, we think it's componential, is because we can actually pick different aspects of awareness and combine them to reach feasible configurations. Or another way around, when you think about your system, what you want to do, you can first see what kind of properties you want, and then you can see what kind of aspects of awareness you are actually needing for the system. So it should help at some level to design these meta-creative systems. How much? Okay. So I'll just go very quickly that here are couple of different configurations. For example, here we have dubbed it this self-guiding. So the self-guiding systems has to be able to make long-term plans and change its generation of artifact if the plan is failing. So in here, how I see it, it needs generator awareness and time awareness so that it estimates how well it is doing, if the current plan it stays unchanged, and if it estimates that the plan is failing, so it doesn't any more satisfy the and start to estimate again. And another type of system is collaborative. So the collaborative system interacts with other agents in an environment to advance a creative common goal. So here I see how I see it. It needs an interaction awareness and a goal awareness. So it controls its communication and adjusts its goals based on the exchange messages. For example, a bunch of agents can divide the creative space into distinct subspaces so that each agent explores only the distinct subspace it has by chasing its own goal of what is reasonable artifact to create. So to conclude, I have presented this componential model of meta-creative systems that is inspired by psychology and self-adaptive systems. And the important bit is that the model or everything revolves around the self-awareness as a self-reflection and self-control. And we can the model suggests these different areas of responsibilities that these actually meta-creative systems can take on their own creative acts. So not just everything is on the designer anymore, but the system evolves to something that maybe the designer didn't know or even couldn't, how you say, well, the designer, something more than the designer believed when he designed the system, he or she designed the system. And the system, this model is designed to help in analysis and development of meta-creative systems and can be used also as a software architecture. I would like to end this with idea that when we are, as say, computational creativity researchers or people that are making applications in the area of computational creativity, we actually have to think really carefully about these generators and other areas that we are building our systems on, to see that what kind of component I'm doing, what kind of reflection my component is allowing me to reflect on, and what kind of control I can use under this component. If I cannot control my artifact generation, how good it is the black box generator, it produces beautiful art, but if I cannot control it, it's kind of, I think then we only go so far. We need to think about how to actually make these kind of components that can be the system itself can modify. Thank you.
Thank you, Simo. Fantastic paper. You're saying things that this community needs to hear, that our systems should be able to reflect back in various different ways and somehow adapt their behavior. So I wanted to ask, what's next? Are you going to be implementing this in a system?
Yeah, our ideas are to add at least some of the aspects. And I think right now it looks like that we are going to focus on interaction awareness first, but let's see.
Again, yeah, great paper. Thank you for that. Meta self-awareness. What about meta self-awareness?
Yeah,
and are you not going down a rabbit hole?
Certain problem. Yeah, we could have meta self-awareness, meta self-awareness, but not. But I at least think that at some point we have to have self-loop where the meta level is reflecting and controlling on itself.
Thank you.
Are there any instances that remotely approach what you're trying to do?
Well, I think in many applications there are. For example, in co-creativity, there is this reflection on the systems or the user, and the system tries to somehow look at what it interacts or how it interacts with the user. But I think one of the reasons for this paper, I actually think that some of you veterans should have written this paper already like several years ago. So I'm looking at you. The reason for the paper was that we are not going there. We are just, I think we are keeping in some kind of circle of several years that we are not going there further. We need to go further in this field.
Oh, okay. I just sort of like the idea that it's turtles all the way down and meta all the way up. So I was struggling to relate what you're talking about with things I've been thinking about for creative design systems. And I'm not sure if this is in your model or in your system or not, your approach or not, but it seems to me that in order to mess with one particular piece of a system, to change something in a system, you need to be able to predict the consequences, because you change one particular piece of generation and it has a knock-on effect to other things which may or may not like it. You also want to anticipate if it's likely to produce something that's creative at the other end.
Yeah.
That requires a model of your system with inputs and outputs and some description of the processing in each of the components. Are you talking about that at all?
You mean like a self-representation of the system for itself?
Yeah.
Well,
so you can predict consequences.
Yeah. Well, I kind of think that the reflection itself is kind of self-representation for the system in some, that what you get from the reflection is kind of the self-representation what you actually see from the system sees from itself. But I think that in some sense the time awareness is what you need to anticipate actually how this is going to change me or the system. Does this answer at all?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I understand, but it's fine.
Hello? Yes. Okay, hello, my name is Wendy Aguilar. I work with Rafael Perez in what we call early creative behavior. If we look into the literature, it is common to find agents that campaign, that can write poems or write any novel or compose any music. And these kind of agents have the characteristic that they need representations of general, but also domain-specific knowledge. And they also need to be programmed with very specific skills to perform their task. However, it is really hard to find works that focus on the genesis of the creative process. That is, agents that start with very basic knowledge about the world they live in, and through there, they develop with time until they become a painter, poet, or a writer. And we call this early creative behavior. We found that the area of developmental robotics could be a very interesting framework to perform this kind of systems. This area of research is interested in creating artificial agents, physical or simulated, that can learn and develop new skills of increasing complexity and in an open-ended fashion. So we believe 3 things. The first one is that the computer creativity required to study the genesis of the creative process. The field of developmental robotics can provide a useful framework toward this aim. And very important, it is necessary, oh, sorry. Here, okay, to start, sorry. Okay. To establish metrics that help us to analyze if a developmental agent is showing a behavior that might be considered as creative. So with this motivation in mind, we realized that the engagement reflection model that Raphael proposed like about 20 years ago, I think, was successfully used to create a writer called Mexica, an interior designer called Eric Designer, and musician called Ermerk, and a visual composer called Flaquilo. So maybe we can use this model of engagement reflection as a general computational model for the creative process. And we wonder if it could be modified in order to model the other end of the spectrum. So we have this end where we have very specific agents, and we wonder if we can modify this same model to create, to model the genesis of the creative process. So with this goal, we look into the psychological literature to find inspiration from some theories. And we found two theories that we think were very helpful for us. The first one was one proposed by Leonora Cohen, who describes creativity as a continuum of adaptive creative behaviors. She divided this continuum in 7 levels. Initially, creativity involves adaptation of the individual to the world, and at the end of this development, it involves adaptation of the world to the individual. And this particular stage, which is the first one, is very similar to what we know as little C creativity concept, that is this kind of creativity that results in products or functions that are useful and new to the individual, but not strange or valuable to others. She considers that this type of creativity can be observed in babies and toddlers as a result of their need to start to adapt to the world. So that leads us to the question, what is adaptation? And the second theory we adopt is the well-known Jean Piaget, who describes adaptation as the ability to adjust to new information and experiences. And adaptation occurs into processes, assimilation and accommodation. The assimilation process allows children to face new situations by using their knowledge from past experiences, while accommodation process allows children to deal with new situations by progressively modifying their knowledge through the continuous interaction with the environment in order to include these results in new experiences. He also defined 2 central concepts in his theory that is called cognitive equilibrium, that happens when children interact with its environment using previously acquired knowledge, and they enter into a state of conflict that he called disequilibrium, cognitive disequilibrium, that happens when interaction with the environment causes a conflict between their knowledge they have constructed and the reality. They also propose that the continuous change between, cognitive equilibrium and disequilibrium promotes children to evolve across 4 different, qualitatively different stages from birth to adulthood. And the first stage that we were interested in is the sensory motor stage, is the first one, and it goes from birth to 2 years old. Something very interesting that I found was that Piaget considered that this is actually the most creative period in life, since during this stage, babies start to construct their knowledge of the world, and this requires a lot of creativity. So this way, during early childhood, creativity, well, we use our creativity to build our knowledge of the world, which is built by continuous adaptation to it, causing us to grow from equilibrium states to disequilibrium states and back to equilibrium, which results in our cognitive development. Okay, so we had these two theories, and we implemented our model that we call DBR, which means development and engagement reflection. And the first step was to construct different environments, virtual environments, in which the agent will be able to interact with, for example, a living room, a park, or a road in the city. And some of the objects that you can find in these environments may be in motion. For example, the cars may be moving over the bridge. Then we created an artificial agent, and we provided it with two characteristics, physical and cognitive. It has a head, eyes, arms, hands, legs, foot, and a trunk. But for this implementation, it only can move its head to the left, right, up, down, its right arm to the left, right, up, down, back, and forth, and its right hand open and close. The rest of its body remains immobile. We also provided this agent with two types of sensors, one for visual and one for tactile information. Regarding the cognitive characteristics, we implemented an attention process, a motivational system, which moved the agent to act, a memory, and it implements an adaptation mechanism that is where the DBR model enters into action. The attention model allows the agent to select only one object present in its environment as its focus of attention. The motivational system simulates two types of affective responses of like and dislike, emotional states of interest, surprise, and boredom, and motivation, and it is the motivation called cognitive curiosity. The agent has also a memory where it stores all of its knowledge, and in particular, it stores in this memory the current context, that is its current perception of the world, and it also stores there schemas that represent how he can interact with the world. The current context is a structure that has this structure, and what is important here is that this representation is in terms of emotional reactions. For example, if the agent is interested in this ball green, then its representation will be that it has pleasure towards or triggered by this green ball. And in this world, schemas are knowledge structures simulating the sensory motor schemas described by Piaget. There are two types, basic, which are schemas that the agent is initialized with, and developed schemas that the agent creates during the execution. And finally, it uses an adaptation mechanism that as I told you before, it is implemented with a modification of the engagement reflection model, and it simulates the assimilation and accommodation processes, or well, it is inspiring the assimilation and accommodation processes that Piaget described. DBR has two ways to use and build the agent's knowledge. One, automatically in engagement through the engagement process, and analytically through the reflection process. In general, engagement works as follows. It takes the current context, the current situation he is perceiving in the world, and then he tries to match this current context with any schema in memory that represents a similar situation that he is perceiving in that moment. The important thing here is that it looks for similar, not identical, but similar situations. Then it gets the schema selected, executes the action, and returns to try to match a schema in memory. During reflection, the agent attempts to analyze the current situation, and with the help of some predefined strategies, attempts to deal with the unknown situation. But we are dealing with a baby, so far the agent doesn't have any heuristic or any kind of mechanism to analyze how to deal with new situations. So this is something that we want to develop over time, and we are wondering how we can do that. Okay, how the agent builds its knowledge of the world. This is a complex mechanism and full of little details, so I'm just gonna say that it simulates the accumulation, equilibration, and assimilation processes. It has some mechanisms for make generalizations and differentiations. And if you are interested in more details, please check this paper, DVR, a computational model of early cognitive development as a creative process, or I will be happy to talk with you after in the break. Well, then we performed 3 different experiments. First, we created this world, a living room. It is composed with objects in different bright colors and sizes, which were placed there to get the agent attention. In particular, there are some balls that are moving from left to right and downwards independently. The agent is initialized, so the only knowledge it knows at the beginning are 2 innate tendencies to preserve pleasant stimuli that the Piaget observed in young babies. And the third schema represents the palmar graph reflex. So in the first test, the agent could only see its world. It couldn't touch it. And in this experiment, the agent learned to visually following the objects in motion. So the ball was passing and he could turn its head and center the object of interest within the center of its field of vision, and staring at static objects in the center of its field of vision. In the second test, we did the opposite. The agent was blind and it was provided with the tactile information. And in this experiment, it was very interesting that we discovered that exactly with the same DVR model, and just by switching the perceptual capacities of the agent learned other things. The agent learned to grasp again an object it has just released. For example, he opened the hand and the, yes, is, what? Okay, the agent learned to grasp an object just released. It learned also to close the hand when an object enters in contact with the hand, but not now as a reflex conduct. Now it had an expectation about this action, and keep holding the objects of its interest. The third test, what we did was to provide the agent with the capability to see and to touch the world, and we initialized it with the 3 basic schemas, and with all the developed visual schemas the agent developed in the first experiment, and with all the tactile schemas that the agent developed in the second experiment. And in this case, it was very interesting that the first behavior the agent showed was that it was visually following its hand by moving its head, centering within its visual field by moving its head, the object being held, seeing within its visual field how its agent grabs and releases the object of interest, seeing how its hand grabbing an object goes out of its visual field and then recovering that image by moving its head, and seeing how its hand grabbing an object goes out its visual field and then recovering that image by moving its hand. Okay, so we wonder, can the learned behaviors be considered as creative? We proposed in this same conference in 2014 some criteria to evaluate if an early behavior could be considered as creative. And we proposed 5 preliminary aspects to measure this. The first one is novelty. And we consider a behavior is novel if it did not exist explicitly on the agent's initial knowledge base. So all the behaviors the agent developed, we can consider as novel. Second, usefulness. A behavior is considered useful if it works as the base for building knowledge, new knowledge that eventually leads the agent to the acquisition of new abilities, characteristic of its next developmental stage. And we also include a third aspect that we call emergence, or that is called emergence, that based on Steele's definition, we propose to consider a behavior as emerging if its origin cannot be directly traced back to the system's components, but if it originates as a result of the way such components interact. In our agent, the learning depends on three factors: environmental properties, physical characteristics of the agent, and its current knowledge. The fourth one is that Amabile distinguished between two types of creativity, intrinsically and extrinsically motivated creativity. And we propose that a behavior that an agent develops should be considered creative only if it resulted from an intrinsic or an extrinsic motivation. In our case, we are modeling the motivation of preserving and conserving, and the implicit stimuli, and the cognitive curiosity. And finally, the ability to adapt to our environments have been seen traditionally, perhaps as of Darwin, as a necessary condition to really creative behavior. We therefore propose that for a behavior developed by the agents to be considered creative, it must have come up as a result of an agent's adaptive process to its environment. So now the agent has developed from very, doesn't work. Okay, well, from very basic knowledge and behaviors to behaviors involving consequences in external objects. Our next step is to take it further to the fourth substage of the sensory motor period. That is a very interesting substage because it is where intentionality emerges. And we hope to see you the next conference and introduce you to our new agent, which will be able, we hope, of showing intentional behaviors. Thank you very much. And your questions, please, to Rafael.
Thanks, Wendy. Do we have any questions?
So this is really exciting work.
Yes.
I think this is what I've been waiting for, really. I have a clarification question. Under your point 4 about motivations, you said that you would consider something creative if it was motivated by either extrinsic or intrinsic motivations.
Mm-hmm.
What else is there?
What?
What else is there?
What else is that?
Yes. So that sounds to me like P or not P.
Ah, okay.
In other words, everything.
If it is not motivated by an intrinsic or an intrinsic motivation, then...
So what, in other words, let me ask the question
Yes.
a different way. What behaviors does your system have which are not resulting from intrinsic or extrinsic motivation?
Okay. Well, what I mean here is that it is common to find works that have, that the programmers explicitly give the goals to the agent. So you program by hand. And in this kind of systems, the important thing is that they created their own goals, or they have their own motives to act on the word. That's what I meant.
Okay, thank you. That's clear.
Any more questions?
I'm wondering how your agent would be programmed to react to understand motivations that you speak of.
Do you mean that how it is programmed to show emotions and curiosity?
To understand motivations, because there has to be some sort of receptor in the program in order to have a reaction to stimuli, right?
Yes, well, until now, these are pre-programmed. The agent feels motivated or attracted towards bright objects, for example, and that causes it pleasure. But that's pre-programmed. I don't know if I answered your question.
So how is that different from the other from some kind of behavior that doesn't result from? I don't see how this is distinguished from just programming the agent to act some way.
Okay.
Like the agent, does the agent have an intention or a desire for itself so that a motivation would be a true motivation?
Okay, let me see if I understand. What our agent has are pre-programmed motivations that are triggered under several circumstances, but these circumstances changes over time. So they evolve with the agent by itself. And for example, cognitive curiosity is triggered in different moments of the agent. It depends if it has just been started, it is curious about some things, and they emerge during the execution of the agent, during the interaction with the environment. But I'm not sure if that answers.
Can I just comment on? We are basing these psychological theories that suggest that new babies are born with certain characteristics. Yes, they are attracted to certain things. So we use as a base. It's the starting point. And so it has very, very basic knowledge about different things, like just holding something and reflection. So based on that, we start to build all the other. So that's the difference. We are not programming the more complicated behaviors or things like that. It starts to build. And based on that, our goal is that it's going to develop also all the kind of different motivations at the beginning are very basic. We are going to start to create more complex based on this automatic development.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we have one last question in the front, I think.
Don't worry, it's a short question. You say there's a preserving pleasant stimuli. How do you determine something is pleasant?
Well, we had a lot of discussions about that during my PhD. And actually, in this implementation, almost everything causes pleasure to the agent. If it touches something, it's a pleasurable sensation. If he sees something, it's a pleasurable sensation. But the idea is to enrich our model in order that with the experience, it learns that, for example, something that is hot is not pleasant. But so far, it doesn't work like that.
Okay, Wendy and Raphael, thank you very much for your work. Thanks. Our next speaker is James Hodson, and he's going to talk about the creative machine, yet another look at the foundations of computational creativity.
Does this work? Okay, great. Thank you for that. And also thanks to the previous speaker and the keynote speaker this morning for introducing some concepts, which I'm not going to belabor too much. But I think what we just heard in the last talk is that it's extraordinarily important to think broadly about the motivations that exist in the environment and what the constraints are that lead, evolutionarily speaking and adaptationally speaking, to certain behaviors occurring in any creative agent, whether that's a human creative agent or if it's a machine that is acting as a creative agent. So I'm going to talk about some of the foundational processes that we discuss when we're thinking about computational creativity. Now, there are a few ground rules. The first is that I'd like to make this session as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, if you want to make disgusted faces at something I say, if you want to shout something out, please do so. Second thing, I'm not trying to reposition any of the research that has been happening in the field of computational creativity. I'm not trying to say that any of it has been misguided. I'm not trying to say that any of it is evaluated in the wrong way. In fact, I think that all of the frameworks that we've been discussing at this conference so far, that have been discussed in the past, most of the ideas that lie at the foundations of why we believe creativity is what it is, stand. All I'm trying to say is, all I'm trying to do is provide you with a few sketches of ideas that might help us think about what that process of creativity really is, and why it might be useful to refocus our ideas about creativity in terms of developing big challenges for the community, in terms of moving forward together towards shared goals. Okay, so again, let's try to make it as interactive as possible. Don't let me just go on because I can keep talking for as long as you need me to. So there are three things that I'd like to achieve today. The first is to have a quick look at some quotes from some papers and give you an idea of why I decided that I should write such a paper, or have, again, some sketches of ideas that I thought might be useful. I want to talk a little bit about creative processes, and I'm going to use some of the ideas that have been presented at the conference already to help me do that. And then I want to provide you with shreds, really shreds of empirical evidence for why I decided to make certain statements. And the idea there is more to amuse you than anything else. And if you think I'm making a broader statement than that, then please tell me and I'll be happy. So in every single paper, practically, that I've read on computational creativity in the last 10 to 15 years, there is usually a nice abstract that describes the goal, and that goal is usually a really worthy goal. Then there is an introduction, and usually a third to a half of the introduction is spent apologizing for creativity and what it means and what it could mean, and maybe redefining some terms about creativity so that we're all starting with the same definitions. Except those definitions sort of vary across papers and nobody agrees. And we know nobody agrees because we keep having these discussions and we have panel discussions and people keep writing papers about it. So I thought, well, since my background is actually as a philosopher, maybe I can also think about these ideas a little bit and offer some of my experiences thinking about reductionist frameworks in philosophy. So my background in philosophy was as a philosopher of mind, cognition, free will, virtue. So I have some frameworks for thinking about these ideas. So I started to look, I looked back at some of the classical papers in this area. So Newell, where there is this four-pronged approach to understanding what creativity means. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. Bowden, the most cited writer in this space. Again, and we've got some really strong tenets about what it means to be creative, what is necessary to be creative. Moving forward, and I think sort of where people are now, which is a move away from trying to define exactly what creativity is in the wild towards a more functional definition. So something that allows us to think about this space in which creativity happens, and also that allows us to actually pose it in a functional sense. So what does it mean to be usefully creative in a human environment, right? Given constraints that we're working with and given goals that we might have. A lot of these definitions include a discussion of creative processes. And these creative processes are sort of assumed that there are some parts of the brain which are devoted to generating creative behavior. Now, on a philosophical note, I have to ask the question, is this a necessary and sufficient condition for creative processes? And I think that it's not necessary, nor is it necessarily sufficient. So let's start there as the first provocative statement that I want to make today. So are humans the only creative agents out there? Interesting question to ask. I think that we gain inspiration from a lot of different areas. And we're certainly the foremost, most interesting creative agent that's out there, I think, because we're the most adaptive, self-organizing, evolutionary system that's out there. But we're not the only creative agent. We're not the only agent that exhibits creative behaviors. In fact, there is creativity pretty much everywhere in the world, and it gets absorbed into what we do, and it helps us to reference the world when we're going about our own behaviors and when we're trying to solve problems in our own right. Now, I made a note to myself on this slide about free will. Why free will? So it was mentioned in the keynote this morning, which was a nice segue to what I wanted to mention. So I've worked in this area for a while, and I want you to think about what is free will, right? So one of the necessary underpinnings of any argument for free will is that an agent is able to act outside of the bounds of the experiences which it has had over its lifetime. Okay. So it has to be that at any point in time, when a decision is confronting the agent, that agent is able to choose from a set of one or more possible options, both physically possible with respect to what that agent would normally want to be doing, and so on. Now I ask you, do you think that's possible, right? In a purely physical universe, as the keynote speaker mentioned, is it possible for an agent to have chosen to do something other than what they did? Right? Now, the general thought in reductionist philosophy and functional philosophy today is no. And in fact, a look even at some of the arguments that were made against this position in the past, such as quantum mechanics and the ability for particles to exist in two states simultaneously, are breaking down today. In fact, if you look at some of the latest mathematics behind quantum mechanics, there is no longer this assumption that there has to be an underlying stochastic process. And this has sort of put a hole in a lot of those philosophical discussions. So free will requires this underpinning ability to act outside of the physical universe. And what I want to put to you is that the kind of creative behaviors that are often referred to require in some way to act outside of the physical universe, outside of the experiences that I've learned. They require a framework that allows us to do something that is novel to a point beyond what would come out of the experiences and out of the mechanisms that we have. And if everything just comes from the experiences and mechanisms that we have, then why do we care about calling it something outside of the ordinary, something surprising, something novel? My argument would be that it's a useful delineation in a post hoc setting. So ex post, I can say in a particular context that a set of learned behaviors that have exhibited some what we deem to be creative outcome happens in a context. And outside of that context, it's meaningless to be talking about this term. Again, this is completely aligned with all of the prior literature. I had an idea for an image that I was going to put on a slide, and then it came out like this, and I decided I would keep it in anyway. And these are all of the really creative ravens that have solved their problem, except none of them turned around to notice that the food was there all along. And in isolation, each one of these ravens is super creative and super smart. And maybe this is not the best analogy, but bear with me on it. But when all of the ravens in the world have solved this problem in the same way, well, this is a learned behavior based on the genetic makeup of ravens and the social behaviors of ravens, and it's not particularly interesting when everybody's done it. Okay, so one of the core messages that I want to provide, again, as a perhaps treat it as a straw man, perhaps shout something out at me if you don't agree, is that there is not a need to postulate creative processes that are constantly trying to achieve creative behaviors in the real world, because any mixture of our neural processes can create behaviors that in certain contexts will be deemed to be creative. In fact, all it does to postulate creative processes in the brain is reduce the scope for understanding the area in which you operate in the first place. Again, I'm making a statement that falls maybe a little bit outside the bounds of what is usually said, so please attack me on it. There is more below it, so I just don't want to take up all of my time with going through. So the same creative processes that we observe when we're generating jazz, when we're generating new movements in dance, when we're speaking in a public setting where we have to improvise in some sense, when we're making artwork, in fact, in pretty much all areas of life, can generate both actions that are deemed to be creative and actions that are deemed not to be creative. In fact, if you ask my wife, sometimes I do some creative things. 99.99999% of the time I do things that are absolutely not creative, and it's exactly the same brain processes behind it that are driving it. I have very few of them, so I'm a pretty good hamster for this experiment. Okay, so now that I've made some provocative statements, and now that you've realized that I'm not actually part of the computational creativity community yet, And so I'm open to being attacked, and you can get away with it, and you can then forget about me. I want to move on to some small empirical experiments that I've done. And again, these are sketches, okay? These are not meant to convince you of anything fundamental. They're not meant to be honest, they were never meant to be seen by a large community of people. These were experiments that were done in a very restricted settings. These were sketches of ideas. And I was very surprised when I was asked to come and present them here. So you get, maybe you'll help me to elaborate them further, and they'll become better with time. So the first thing we're going to look at is just concepts of creativity out in the wild, and web scale data is out there. So I'm going to get some toy data from Google and show you some correlations. And then we're also going to look at what people mean when they're thinking about creativity. And the most amusing part, hopefully I'll make you laugh at least a little bit, or chuckle, or try not to laugh so I don't get too excited about it. Some ideas on background creativity. So what does it mean for things to seem creative in the world outside of any particular attempts to be creative? Okay, so usual suspects when people are actually looking for creativity. What are the other words that appear around it? Well, sure, innovation, imagination, novelty, intelligence, right? You see intelligence here is a big theme. That's because maybe AI is an umbrella for all of the work that we're doing. It could be that intelligence is just the main concept that allows all of these channels to exist. So how do these trends look? So over time, people who search for creativity on Google or Bing also search for these other terms at the same time. Okay, that's not particularly interesting. We can kind of expect that this would happen. This is not that interesting either. Okay, so here are some words that co-locate when people search for creativity, right? So these are the ideas that people have about what creativity means in some embedding, right? So innovation, imagination, originality, to unleash. These are very artistic leaning versions of what we mean by creativity. Okay, again, I wasn't really expecting to present that in front of a large number of people. I feel a bit embarrassed, but we're past it now. So a little bit more interesting, just because I've spent a lot of time in knowledge representation over the years, and I've worked with the psych team on a couple of projects, and I thought this was kind of interesting. I would take, who's heard about psych actually in the audience? Okay, great. So enough of you that I can talk about this. So psych is one of the largest experiments in building a manually annotated base of knowledge and common sense reasoning style knowledge. And it was started by Doug Leonard, basically in the 70s, and it's continued to this day. Probably the largest progress on it has been over the last 15, 20 years, when Michael Whitbrock was the chief scientist at Psych. He moved there from Lycos and introduced a lot of more statistically driven ways of interpreting what was going on in Psych, and in terms of adding more knowledge into the database. So it's more than 1 million human-defined assertions about what common sense is and what people can do to things. And it contains a lot of information about Afghanistan and military stuff and so on. But it's kind of useful for this experiment because it has a feature called logic to NL, logic to natural language. So I can ask Psych to generate assertions from its knowledge base, novel assertions, things that it doesn't know, but things that it can infer by looking a certain number of degrees away from a node that's provided with certain parameterization. So it generates assertions across its nodes and the edges and the relationship it knows, and then it gives me a sentence. So some of the sentences that it gives me are: a feeling of anger is likely to be accompanied by a feeling of hatred. It's reasonable. Every paper contains some weather report, newspaper. In dropping the falling step ends later than the release of support step. That was actually for a robotics project. Okay, so then we took this, and basically me and 2 other people annotated it for novelty, surprise, and value, because these were 3 of the terms that came up most in papers on computational creativity and what it means to be creative. And we chose a scale of 1 to 5 for no particular reason. And then we plotted these, and we started looking at the ones that were furthest along the distribution. So the ones that were most novel, most surprising, most valuable, according to the author's altered state of mind during this experiment. And here were some things that came out. Now, I'm not going to argue that these are creative, but they're kind of nice to put on the last slide so that you forget about all the other stuff I've said, right? And I thought they might make you chuckle a little bit, like the fact that Sauron the enemy heads the government of Mordor, which was not something I had thought about actually during The Lord of the Rings. And I'm not sure I agree with the last one. I think this is still something that we have a problem with. But it is true, just with this, like in this presentation, that no time lasts longer than forever, right? So what are some key takeaways from this? So it's not that I want to change anything, right? I had some ideas that I thought might be interesting to talk about, and I put them into a paper. There is, I think, an interesting discussion to be had about where we place our focus as a community, right? And I'm, again, putting this out there as an outsider. When I say community, I'm sort of making a bit of a presupposition. But what I think is that we put a lot of emphasis on the output of the models as conforming to certain fairly restrictive creative goals. Okay, we have an idea. We're experts in a particular domain. We have an idea of what the shape of certain outputs should look like. And I think that this ends up being quite restrictive, right? On the other hand, what I'd like to see, and what I did get a lot of kind of a feeling for in the past days, is a push towards a deeper understanding of the originating domains, so that that space in which creativity happens can be as broad as possible, right? And this is not just true about the computational creativity crowd. This is true in the semantic web space. It's true in machine learning. It's true in AI in general. There is a need to go back to our understanding of those fundamental sort of spaces, those fundamental knowledge and the representations that we choose, because they're going to dictate what we get in the output, right? And we can always add, like I grew up in machine translation, right? Through the late 90s and early 2000s. And we could always add an extra blue point, which is our evaluation measure, by tweaking something in the system, or by adding a function here or there that would go and change a preposition and so on. But it wouldn't mean anything except getting an extra blue point and an extra publication, right? Sometimes what we needed to do was go back and completely rethink about what language was and why we were trying to translate in order to do a better job. And I'm not saying that people have been doing this badly here. I'm just saying, let's not forget that this is sometimes necessary. Lastly, a quick note about fMRIs and putting jazz musicians into fMRIs tied down. So this is quite an interesting thing. I don't know how many of you have been tied down in an fMRI machine before inside a large magnet. I was for a short period of time. I don't think it had anything to do with fMRI. I think it just had to do with tying me down. The other problem with it is if you put somebody into an fMRI machine and you ask them, okay, follow a piece of music you know and then improvise, you get certain brain patterns out. There was a great study at Harvard, MIT showing this. If you put in a non-creative, non-jazz musician and you ask them, count from 1 to 10, and then you ask them, say random words that come to your mind, you have the exact same brain processes happening. But that wasn't actually mentioned in the paper. I just want to say to you that, we also have to be very careful about how we combine our knowledge from different domains, because it can lead to quite interesting outputs. Okay, now I leave the floor open to attack me. And there is actually rotten fruit in the corners. So if you want to.
Thanks very much. Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. It's always great to hear what philosophers think of the field. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions and comments. Okay, yeah.
Thank you so much for your paper. I actually enjoyed it a lot. I'm a philosopher as well. So I have a question about this is my opinion, that we can actually break it down in purely materialistic way, like probably Dan Dennett would propose. And what
Sorry,
I
I
was
didn't
trying
catch
to
the
do,
last part.
Dan Dennett
Yeah.
proposed,
Yep.
and I don't probably familiar with his work. What he's trying to separate is a competence and comprehension, right? So we can build much more competent machines than our brains in certain ways, but he's sort of hinting that creativity, this sort of interesting way we put things together, comes from the levels of comprehension. So when, right, he's always saying that this will be the last bastion for creative, computing to accomplish, because there is certain algorithms in comprehension which are sort of invisible for us right now. They might be, from a materialistic point of view. He's hopeful that it's going to be cracked, right? But this is the reason why I'm pushing against just thinking about creativity as the random generation of ideas. This is the reason why I'm like, listen, there's comprehension element in it.
Absolutely,
right?
I don't think anybody would agree that it would be useful, right, to push for a random generation of anything coming from the human brain, because this is sort of vacuous, right? We do everything within a context of both learning and experience. I had the pleasure a couple of weeks ago of actually attending Dan's lecture at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, and the launch of his new book, or at least kind of a big signing ceremony for the new book. And I love to see him speak. For those of you who aren't familiar, Dan's latest work is also looking at how swarm intelligence, in a way, and evolutionary intelligence can happen across species, across generations of species, and how this is really driven by what he calls memes, right? So it's a meme being a symbol in society that we jointly own and that we can transform. And he has this nice picture of the termite colony that built the cathedral that looks a little bit like Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. And I think I agree totally with what you're saying, that there are aspects of that which can be useful.
But there's a way, and people who are trying to crack it on sort of evolutionary level, that this algorithm I'm trying to sort of gauge what that might be actually very similar to processes in evolution, which is randomization and selection.
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned at the very beginning was that humans are, by their essence, self-adaptive evolutionary systems constrained by their environment. And we have intrinsic goals, which are survival, and we also have goals that have been developed extrinsically societally, which can relate to wanting to please other people, right? Because that plays a certain function in society. And that a lot of our musical culture comes from this sharing of messages and sharing of communications and emotions between people. So you can see that as actually a constraint on goals that we have inherently, and therefore you don't need to view this as necessarily a separate framework to understand.
Hello, and thank you for an interesting talk. I don't disagree with you at all. I think what you said is absolutely right. And this is the whole debate about mere generation versus computational creativity, right? So you start off with generation, and you have to reflect, as we've heard a lot. So you need mechanisms for that. Now, what I'm about to say may be incorrect because it's based on just hearing what just transpired, which is this notion of stochastics and randomness. The impression I got there in the previous discussion was that randomness is somehow a cop-out. Maybe that's not the case, but let me just argue against that claim anyway. The point of stochastic processes and the kind of modeling that we do for these things is not that one is rolling a die and that you have an equal number of an equal possibility, and an equal probability for every single outcome, right? That is what many people think randomness means. I've experienced this time and time again. It is not. Randomness is a kind of reasoning in the context where you have distributions which are informed by context, which is exactly what one learns from the world. Yep. So there is lots of evidence actually that brains are doing stochastic things, and those distributions are derived from experience, which matches exactly on what you're saying. You don't need quantum mechanics or anything to explain it, although Penrose thinks you do, but that's to do with consciousness, not to do with behavior.
So I agree. So in terms of distributional assumptions on how we make decisions, I agree with you entirely. We do have distributions over likely outcomes that help inform our decision making, and it's somehow mediated in some conscious sphere of our brains. I would argue, though, that our final decision about which action to choose, right, is some kind of maximum likelihood over this. It's not that there is, it's not that in exactly the same, the only argument in the philosophical sense is if you're in exactly the same situation with exactly the same information and exactly the same prior experience, you cannot take anything but the option that you chose to take. And that's regardless of what distributions existed in your brain that played into that final decision being possible. But it does rule out this folk randomness, which is what you're not talking about, but that's the aim of that particular argument. It's not to argue against having distributions over our behaviors, but it is to argue against this folk randomness, this idea that things happen out of nothing.
That's helpful. Thank you for the clarification. Can I do another one? I've got time? Yeah, okay. So your Raven slide, I mean, these very clever corvids are a really interesting example. And I just wanted to clarify something you said, because it worried me a bit. You said that if every Raven in the world can solve that problem, then it's genetically determined.
No, I didn't mean to say that. That was that slipped out because I can. Okay. My language generator decided to put the word in.
Okay, fine. Right. So I mean, there is a thing called the Baldwin effect, right, which creates an evolutionary pressure when a species can learn to do something like that, so it becomes genetically determined.
No, I agree with you. And the moment I said that word, my meta self said, "You idiot." Okay. But I was hoping nobody noticed. So you know,
sorry.
Good job there.
Okay, let's thank James again. Thank you. So next up, and giving the last talk of the session and of the conference, we have Christian. Oh, your slides are moving. Christian Guckelsberger, talking about addressing the why in computational creativity.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real privilege for me to do this last talk in the conference, and I'm really happy to be doing this session because I thought this talk could actually deepen some of the things we've heard earlier on today a bit more. And I was thinking about how to get your attention before the coffee break and lunch, so I thought I would start with a big, bold claim. So in this presentation, I will outline our argument while there is no existing system in computational creativity, including my systems, which we could generally describe as not merely generative. So I argue that everything we have so far is still merely generative. That's not meant in an offensive way. What I actually try to advocate here is that we have to answer some questions in our domain, not in a hand-wavy manner, but we have to go a bit deeper. And that's what I'm going to try here. So what I think, so some of the most fundamental questions in our domain is what can we create, how can we create it, so the artifacts in the process. But I think there's one more, and that is the why in computational creativity. And here's a thought experiment to start with. So the painting fool is one of the most popular, one of the most well-known systems in computational creativity, as far as I'm aware. And it came with this big goal to be one day taken seriously as an artist in its own right. So what happens when we ask the painting fool, why did you paint my portrait that way? And we assume here that the painting fool can actually answer these questions, and we also assume that he would answer these questions truthfully. Well, it would answer because I was reading the following newspaper article in The Guardian, for instance, and this was used to stimulate a mood which drove the artistic choices I made. We could then go on and ask, okay, why were you actually reading the newspaper to drive your artistic choices? And the painting fool would answer, because my programmer told me to do so. Well, that's not really satisfying, is it? But inquisitive as we are, we could just go on and say, okay, why did your program actually tell you to read the newspaper? And it would respond so that I have an interesting backstory for my creative acts. And we could go on, and then finally ask, okay, why do you need such backstory? And it would generally respond so that it appear more creative. So this is the question of why I believe addresses the system's intentionality. And that was defined by Dan and others as the capacity of being deliberative or purposive, as a goal or directive of creative action. And these goals in computational creativity are usually modeled with value functions. So we use these value functions to decide which action to take, and we use them as a fitness function in artifact selection post hoc. But the painting fool cannot explain its choices without ultimately and exclusively referring to its designer and other people, for instance, the creator of the Guardian article. So it only sustains an impression of intentionality. So even if we consider creativity an essentially contested concept, we have to understand that the inability to account for intentionality makes it much more likely for us that our systems are going to be disapproved of being creative by an unbiased observer. And that's basically just what Dan said. It's the first nail to our coffin. And now I ask you to think of your systems, because I don't think that this is a specific thing to the painting fool. It generalizes across the domain. So why does Mishika, for instance, create narratives, and why does Darcy criticize art, and why the hell does Deep Tingle create fantastic gay erotica? So something is probably missing here. And I think we can probably get closer to this if you look at definitions of creativity. So where is value in the definition of creativity? And here's our most famous definition of psychological creativity, peer creativity by Bowden. There's still an account for value in there, but as soon as Bowden moves away from the human domain into the biological domain and marvels the wonders of nature, the concept of value is gone. So she only attributes values to system here from the external perspective and not from inside a system, and only makes this a bit more explicit by defining generative or value-less creativity. But he also contrasts this with the definition of adaptive creativity, where a system creates new patterns or behaviors to the benefit of that system itself. The problem is that we have no idea what that actually means. So we believe computational creativity lacks both a theoretical foundation and a formal model to account for values and goals from a system's own perspective, in contrast to the perspective of its designer or a human observer. And we believe that this has quite significant consequences for all of us, and not only for those of us who are interested in the strong aims of computational creativity. Because what does that mean? Even if we want to create a creativity support system, if our system does not have any own goals, it relies on us to define these goals. And therefore, it relies on our skills to anticipate whatever's going to happen to the system, whatever the system is going to encounter. That brings a massive problems for generality and robustness. On the other hand, if we look into truly autonomous computational creativity systems, there cannot be creativity in its own right if a system does not act to its own goal. We cannot even talk about a soft form intentionality here. It would be as if, I don't know, it would be as if you said that Tony, for instance, acted the way he did and behaved the way he did, although he was all the time controlled by Simon Colton, right? So, not entirely sure, right? Furthermore, we cannot say that any system that does not have any own values really fully owns its artifacts. So these are quite important consequences. Our goal here was to develop a minimal and non-human-centric, but still agent-centric model of intentional creative agency in computational creativity. And when we say minimal, I'm not talking about minimal in terms of human minimal developmental agents, as Wendy proposed earlier on today. We want to identify and characterize the first and simple situation in which we can talk about creativity and intentional agency in an artificial system. So, as I said, I think this generalizes across all systems we got so far. So the next question to address is, well, why is that actually the case? And if we start with the painting fool, we've got a symbolic computational creativity system. And in fact, most of the systems we have in this community so far are still symbolic. So the problem with these systems is that try to achieve creativity by the manipulation of symbols alone, is that they're subject to a couple of hard AI problems. And one of these problems is a symbol grounding problem. That's exemplified in a Chinese room argument, and Al-Rifai and Mark Bishop have shown a while ago that this also applies to computational creativity. So syntax is not sufficient for semantics. What this implies is, I can't go into detail here, that symbolic computational creativity is fundamentally incapable of grounding meaning, which means it cannot give rise to goals which are meaningful from the system's own perspective. Well, some of us have noticed that and moved into the physical domain and created embodied systems. And that resolves the system somehow, because we embed an agent in a closed sensor motor loop. We do something, we get a perception, and we can ground our symbols in the environment. We can use the world as its own best model. And what we can see here, for instance, on the left side, I brought two example projects, is Shimon, which we have seen this morning already, a robot marimba player which makes use of its morphology, makes use of this idea to be in a situated environment by not considering music as a sequence of notes, but as a sequence of movement, as a choreography in space. On the right-hand side, we have Curious Whispers, a system developed by Rob Saunders, where multiple agents in the environment create new tunes and listen to the tunes of others. And this is all about experimenting with our agent morphology and the situatedness. Now, this can actually give rise to more interesting forms of creativity. So now that we can probably solve the symbol grounding problem, we have another opportunity to talk about our value functions. And I brought these two examples because they're quite different in the value functions they use. On the left-hand side, we have extrinsically defined values. In terms of the goals of these systems, they're still extrinsically defined by their creators. On the right-hand side, however, we have Curious Whispers with an intrinsic value function. So here, the robots seek new tunes according to a function of curiosity. And that's actually quite much more interesting, because in this case, we have much more robustness. These systems can actually deal with failure. If something fails in the environment, if something changes, if the morphology changes and the whole environment, these systems stay robust. They still give us interesting behavior in the absence of the designer. So this seems to take us a bit closer to our goal to ground goals in the system's own behavior, because here goals are actually formed from agent internal experiences alone. However, is that all we need? Well, I think it's a really good start. And if you take anything away from this slide, if you don't from this presentation, if you don't agree with the rest that's to come, I ask you to reconsider the use of these models in your research, if appropriate. However, we have to think about, can we simply take any arbitrary model of intrinsic motivation, such as curiosity, and simply impose it on our agents? So why would the robots in Curious Whispers actually seek for new and interesting tunes and not just for a dark corner? So even if these models are actually biomotivated, why is this model the right choice for our agent? Is there some sort of deeper purpose? So the question we want to address is, when does a particular intrinsic value function reflect a system's own goals and not the designer's? And here's a hint from the past. I came across this in the London Gallery a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was quite interesting. So already in 1971, Manfred Mohr, one of the pioneers of early computer art, was asking his audience in a Paris museum, what do you think of aesthetic research made with the help of a computer? And the responses we got, of course, all deal with the differences between people and computers. And one member of the audience said, well, for computers or for robots, even the pens run out and the machine stops. So this seems to be about the ability of our mental ability to keep on going and to maintain our activity. And that's actually all what the enactive AI framework is about, that we base our claims on. So here, the idea behind the enactive AI framework is to find the necessary requirements for intentionality or for our value function to reflect what is relevant from the system's own perspective. And they base some of their claims on research of the biophilosopher Hans Jonas, who made a distinction between us as living beings and robots and stones and most computers, because we as living beings have to constantly interact with the environment. We have to keep doing stuff in order to sustain our precarious existence. And by precarious existence, I mean all the dependencies we have on the environment, such as energetic dependencies, material dependencies. I mean, we have to be assured we're not going to starve. I mean, there was no threat at this conference, but there is a threat in general. There are diseases that could attack us, that sort of thing. And robots do not have to do that. So there seems to be an essential ontological difference here. And I propose two principles to bring robots closer to, or to create this sort of purpose in robots. So one principle here is that an agent capable of intentional agency has to fulfill something that's called constitutive autonomy. It has to be constitutively autonomous instead of just behaviorally autonomous. So it has to be able to generate its own systemic identity at some level of description, to separate itself physically from the rest of the world. But that's not really enough, because at least in nature we can see that living beings can actually, they can deal with unexpected events in the environment, they can counteract perturbations in the environment. So we need a bit more than that, we need adaptivity. So while inactive AI gives us the conditions for an intrinsic value function to reflect an agent's own goals, the focus is on intentional agency in general, but we're interested in creativity, of course. So our goal was to extend this framework with an account for creativity, and we focus on the two most popular factors in the attribution of creativity here, namely novelty and value. So the active AI framework and these conditions now allow us to identify where generative creativity, where adaptive creativity, where all these things actually happen. And what you can see here is a process of self-emergence, simulation. And on the left side, it's just a number of molecules which then react. And on the top line, you can see that they react and then they dissolve. Nothing happens. Right on the bottom line, however, you can see that with time, something emerges, a stable configuration. As long as this emergence is still happening, as this identity is still shaped in the environment, but we're not fully there, we cannot talk about anything else but generative or biological creativity, because we cannot assume there to be any value from the system's own perspective. We can only attribute value externally, which is fine, but we have to make that clear. As soon as the system, however, created an identity out of this molecular soup, we can start talking about adaptive creativity, because we have to assume some value function to be existing in order to allow the system to actually survive and maintain its behavior. So we can now talk more about adaptive creativity and actually concretize the notions in there. So as Ollie defined it, adaptive creativity means a system that creates its own new patterns or behaviors to the benefit of that system. So an active AI gives us an idea of what that benefit is. In such a system, any structural change that preserves the system's constitutive autonomy, preserves its identity and environment, is of value. And you can see here a series of these changes in the game of life, where the collider is taken as one model of such a self-sustaining system. Novelty, in this case, is just a function of structure and the internal dynamics. So the next state of the system just depends on the current state and the internal dynamics. And that's actually quite trivial. And it doesn't really allow us to attribute any creativity to such a system, because anything in the system could be fully pre-specified. This sort of steps, this circular evolution here is quickly exhausted. However, in the real world, these systems, any system in the physical world is subject to perturbations in terms of active dependencies on the environment, or in terms of things that threaten us, such as illnesses, for instance. And here novelty becomes a function not only of the structure and internal dynamics, but also of the environmental dynamics as well. And that makes it non-trivial. That makes it really interesting, because we cannot hardwire these systems anymore. We get a viability trade-off in this case, because the more we add to the complexity of these systems, the more information processing I have to do, the more energy I need, and the lower their viability becomes. So we believe that any constitutively autonomous and adaptive agent, any agent that is able to create its own identity in its environment, in a physical environment, which is sufficiently rich, must necessarily be adaptively creative. In other words, if the inactive AI conditions are actually sufficient for intentionality, we can assume that any intentional agent must necessarily be creative. That's a really big claim, right? So coming to an end. What we've basically done here is we've rooted value and behavior in an arbitrary system in its embodiment. So this behavior depends on our body on the way we can access the world with our actions, and the way we can perceive the world with our senses and our senses, on the way we depend on the world and how we are vulnerable in this world. However, the important bit is that our embodiment is very different from the embodiment of all the machines out there and that we usually use in our everyday work. And this has quite severe implications. One of this implication is that, strictly speaking, no existing computational creativity system goes beyond mere generation. And the simple reason is that when we impose a function on the system, so far we have done that without taking the embodiment of that system and the value of that system, the perspective of that system into account. We do not have some form of intentionality, even not a soft one. There's no intentionality in there so far. The second implication I want to discuss is that human-level intentional agency might be extremely hard. And that's because in order to replicate values that a person feels, we might actually have to replicate human embodiment. That's a tough task. That's something that Hubert Dreyfus actually put forward a couple of years ago for intelligence in general. So here's the road ahead. This wouldn't be a computational creativity paper if we didn't propose any formal models, of course. So in our paper, we relate to a number of formal principles that could potentially represent such a value function in an agent, and we presented some of them at A-Live last year. So the next big task is to actually employ these in physically embodied agents with a precarious existence and see what happens. The biggest challenge, of course, is to close the explanatory gap between this really minimal model and big C human-level creativity, which is shaped in a social context. So that's a tough task, and in our paper we propose a first hypothesis how we can actually climb up the creativity ladder again and get closer to this sort of behavior. But we believe that this could actually be an interesting effort that we could establish together with existing CC research methodology. Finally, I want to say that I think in this paper we raised more questions than we actually answer, but they are really interesting. So I would advocate this as a really new research direction in computational creativity, where we look at minimal creativity and address intentional creativity agency from the bottom up. And I finished this presentation by asking the question that actually fascinated me most and drove me to do this research. So if embodied systems establish their own world of meaning relative to the embodiment, what do their creative artifacts look like, and how are they actually different from ours? Thanks.
Thanks, Christian. Okay, we'll take the three questions that I can see in the audience, and then we'll have to stop after that.
Hi, Christian. I think I agree with your critique. Some sharp paper, good arguments. I also like your suggestion for future research.
I can see there's a bot coming.
However, I think why not take it even further? Why not question whether these pretty stringent requirements you put up actually apply to humans? I mean, because basically, in general, all this debate about what computational creativity is very closely mirrors the debate about artificial general intelligence that goes on. We see the same arguments being put up back and forth, and it's called creativity in one community, it's called general intelligence in the other community. And I'm of the opinion that we don't have general intelligence, we humans, and I don't think we have much of creativity either. Maybe as a society, but not very much individually. I think what you're saying there is that these are fantastic sort of end goals, but I'm not sure we have much of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe there's something I can add to this, yes. Something that we discovered while doing this research, something we've been asking ourselves is, okay, if creativity is an essentially contested concept, we are pretty sure there are systems out there people would call creative, although they do not have this sort of adaptive creativity or intentionality at all. But we were wondering, what about the inverse case? Could there be systems out there that are adaptively creative and that are not deemed creative by us? I think it's actually really important to look at this, because if we take the right perspective and if we consider how embodiment shapes value, and therefore creativity in these systems, we can potentially identify creativity out there already in the natural realm. And that's really interesting for us because I think we are constrained in our creativity by our embodiment. And so are these systems, but they're constrained in a different way. I think this could actually inspire our research as well. So that's about how our creativity is not really general either. Then we've been asking ourselves something that probably some of you are asking yourself as well. Well, does this still apply to people, right? Do people, why can people not account, for instance, why they're being creative in some instances? And one interesting answer to this would be because we are beings with bounded rationality. We have limits to our information processing, to our memory, and so far. And if we act very far away from the edge of being that we've just been describing here, you know, the principles that drive us and these values might actually work much better close to the edge of being than far away, and the behavior might become much more arbitrary. Just a few thoughts on that. I don't know if I answered the question, but.
I don't know if it's possible to answer that.
Yeah, good point.
Hey, so first off, thank you for the talk. I'm really glad this was the final one. I'm a big fan of your first initial points there. I wanted to ask you a question about your sort of framing of embodiment as a solution or potential solution here. So as Jill Weinberg brought up in his really excellent keynote, robots are constructed by people, right? He made a choice to have 4 arms, 8 sticks instead of 80 arms, 160 sticks or something like that. So there's still designer values going in, even into the embodiment, yes, even to the structure of these things. How would you respond to that in terms of this framework?
Well, in that case, I have to refer clearly to Tom Fröse and Tom Siemke, who came up with the Enactive AI framework and discussed exactly this point in a more general AI context, not focusing on creativity. And they basically advocate a completely different approach to engineering. They basically call what we do at the moment synthetic engineering. We put these parts still together, right? What I advocate is a second-order engineering of emergence, where a system actually comes into being autonomously, forms its constitutive autonomy, and therefore has exactly the embodiment that it needs in a certain niche. So there's a different approach to this as well, but that's, of course, another big step. And from an engineering perspective, we are not there yet.
So my question is in a way expanding on the first question. So first of all, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting and thought-provoking. So I wanted to focus more on this idea of independent intentionality rather than embodiment, because I think I agree with you on the latter. So going back to humans, it seems to me that it happens fairly often that creative acts can be traced back to somebody else's intention, especially if we look at parents, bosses, clients, that kind of situations. Of course, humans might typically have longer chains than the painting fool. So I was wondering if you could comment about it, kind of these comparisons with humans' intentionality traced to somebody else, and also if perhaps the length of the chain is significant.
Well, I guess there's general agreement in this community that creativity doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? That it is a social activity, a situated activity, and clearly our values as people in human creativity, if that's like creative problem solving or artistic creativity, they do not only like come from us, right? That's clear. The problem with the symbolic systems and the systems I've been showing here in this review are that values in these systems exclusively come from outside, right? And I'm just advocating an approach where there's some form of intrinsic account of value as well.
Okay, can we thank Christian again, please? Thanks. Thanks to all of our speakers in this session. So this concludes the talks part of the conference. Next up, we have lunch. And after that, we have a community meeting, which Ashok's going to comment.
Thank you, Alison. First, usually we do lunch until 1:30, but today we'll make a small schedule change. Can you please come back here by 1:15, not 1:30? So shorter lunch today. And the reason is that we have a community meeting immediately after that. And as Raphael will tell you, we're going to make a lot of exciting announcements there, and the community meeting will take a little bit longer than we anticipated. But the entire conference will end at 2:30. If you can come here after lunch at 1:15, that would be great. Thank you very much.